6:20 in the morning. July 26th, 1831. William Manning stood at the edge of his wheat field in Rockbridge County, Virginia, watching a machine he'd paid good money to mock. Manning owned 340 acres. He'd harvested wheat the same way for 19 years. Cradle scythe. 4 men per day could cut about an acre and a half if the weather held, and nobody's back gave out. He'd heard about Cyrus McCormick's reaper. Heard it was supposed to do the work of 10 men. Heard it looked like a lumber wagon that had mated with a windmill. Manning didn't believe a word of it. He'd gathered 23 neighboring farmers that morning to watch the thing fail. McCormick had agreed to the demonstration. One day, his machine against Manning's best crew. Whoever cut more wheat by sundown won the wager. Manning had bet $60. Yeah, the reaper weighed 632 pounds. Most of that weight was in the iron blade and the wooden frame that carried it. The machine that William Manning came to ridicule would harvest 6 acres of wheat before the sun went down. His crew would cut half that, and Manning would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to other farmers why he'd been wrong. Before we go further, if you care about forgotten stories like this, about the machines that built rural America and the people who didn't believe in them until they had no choice, hit subscribe. These stories disappear if nobody's watching. The mechanical reaper wasn't supposed to be revolutionary. It was supposed to be impossible. For every year of recorded agriculture in America, grain harvest had been limited by one thing: human endurance. A man with a cradle scythe could cut about an acre and a half of wheat per day if conditions were ideal. Weather cool, wheat dry, back strong. But a farm in Virginia in 1831 might have 60, 80, 100 acres of wheat. All of it ripened within the same 2-week window. Cut it too early and the grain was soft. Too late and it shattered on the stalk. The entire year's income depended on getting every acre harvested in that window. So farmers hired crews, 20 men, 30 men, however many it took. They paid in cash, in meals, in room and board. A harvest crew in Virginia in 1831 cost a farmer between $40 and $90 depending on acreage. That was more than most families spent on clothing in a year. More than they spent on livestock medicine. Harvest wages were the second largest expense on a grain farm after land taxes. And there was no way around it. If you didn't hire the crew, the wheat stayed in the field. If the wheat stayed in the field, you lost the farm. Inventors had been trying to mechanize harvest for 50 years. There were patents on file in England dating back to 1780. Spring-loaded blades, rotating scythes, toothed wheels that were supposed to comb grain off the stalk. None of them worked in field conditions. They jammed in damp wheat. They shattered dry stalks. They required 3 men to operate and cut less than 1 man with a hand tool. By 1830, mechanical reapers were a punchline. A thing rich men patented and poorer men laughed at. Cyrus McCormick wasn't rich. His father Robert had tried to build a reaper for 28 years and failed. Cyrus took over the project in 1831. He was 22 years old. He had no formal engineering training. What he had was a farm that was about to go under, and a father who'd spent the family's savings on a machine that didn't work. The McCormick family owned 532 acres in Rockbridge County, Virginia. They grew wheat, kept livestock, and operated a small blacksmith forge. In 1830, Robert McCormick owed $1,847 to creditors in Richmond. The farm was worth about $3,200 if sold at auction, but land prices were falling. Wheat prices were falling faster. The only way to stay ahead was to cut costs. Labor was the cost Robert couldn't reduce, so he'd tried to eliminate it. He'd built 6 different reaper prototypes between 1802 and 1830. Every one of them failed in the field. The last one had cost $140 in materials and had cut 9 feet of wheat before the blade jammed and snapped the driving rod. Now Cyrus watched it happen. He was 21. He went back to the forge and started over. The machine Cyrus McCormick built in 1831 had 7 components. A straight blade with triangular teeth, each tooth 3 inches long. A reciprocating drive system that pushed the blade back and forth horizontally, 14 inches per stroke. a wooden platform called a reel that pushed standing wheat toward the blade, a divider rod that separated the wheat to be cut from the wheat still standing, a main wheel 5 feet tall that powered the whole system through ground contact, a draft pole for a single horse, and a seat for the operator. Total weight, 632 pounds. It looked like no farm implement anyone had seen. The blade stuck out to the side like a broken wing. The reel looked like a paddle wheel mounted sideways. Farmers called it McCormick's folly, McCormick's contraption, McCormick's expensive joke. Cyrus called it a reaper. He needed to prove it worked or his family lost the farm. William Manning heard about the machine in June of 1831. A neighbor mentioned that young McCormick was offering public demonstrations. Manning didn't believe it. He'd seen reaper patents before. He'd watched one sure to work in a field near Lexington in 1828. It had cut about 40 feet of wheat in 3 hours and then broken a wheel. The inventor had loaded it back on a wagon and left. Manning figured McCormick's machine would do the same, but McCormick kept offering. He'd bring the reaper to any farm. He'd cut against any crew. He'd work a full day and let the landowner measure the results. If the reaper lost, McCormick would pay for the wasted time. Manning took the offer, and he didn't take it because he thought the machine would win. He took it because $60 was good money, and he wanted to watch McCormick eat crow in front of 24 witnesses. July 26, 1831. The demonstration started at 6:20 in the morning. Manning had assembled 4 of his best cradlers. John Hewitt, age 31. Daniel Koger, age 28. Samuel Bracken, age 35. And Michael Ewing, age 26. All 4 men had been cutting wheat for more than a decade. They knew Manning's fields. They knew the soil was rocky near the north end, and the wheat there grew shorter. They knew the southeast section had a slope that made cradling harder, but the stalks were thicker. They picked the northeast field. 12 acres. Flat ground. Wheat 4 feet tall and dry enough to cut clean. Perfect conditions. The plan was simple. Start at first light. Cut until noon. Break for water and meal. Cut until sundown. Measure the acreage. Manning would measure for the hand crew. McCormick would measure for his machine. A third man, Thomas Edmonds, a neighboring farmer with no stake in the outcome, would verify both measurements. Manning expected his men to cut 5 acres, maybe 6 if they pushed. He expected McCormick's reaper to cut 2 at most, probably less once it broke down. The reaper started cutting at 6:27 a.m. Cyrus McCormick sat on the operator's seat. His younger brother Leander walked beside the horse, guiding it in straight passes across the field. The blade reciprocated at 40 strokes per minute. Each stroke was 14 inches. The reel pushed wheat toward the blade in steady waves. The cut stalks fell onto the platform and were raked off manually by a third man walking alongside. The machine moved at roughly 2.5 miles per hour. It cut a swath 7 feet wide. The sound was like nothing the farmers watching had heard. A steady metallic chatter, rhythmic and fast. The blade moved faster than a man's arm could swing a scythe. It never slowed, it never stopped to rest, it just kept cutting. John Hewitt and the other cradlers started their first pass at 6:30. They worked in a line, each man offset by 10 feet. The cradle scythe cut with a sweeping motion, low and horizontal. The cut stalks landed in the cradle's wooden fingers, and the cradler laid them down in neat rows for binding. It was skilled work. A good cradler could maintain pace for 2 hours before needing a break. Hewitt was good. He'd cut wheat every July since he was 16. His first pass took 11 minutes and covered about 220 feet. He bent, swung, stepped, laid the stalks, bent again. The motion was smooth. It was also exhausting. By 7:15, all 4 men were sweating. The temperature was 71 degrees. By 10, it would be 86. McCormick's reaper finished its first acre at 8:04 a.m., 1 hour and 37 minutes. The cradlers had finished half an acre combined. Manning stood at the field edge with his arms crossed. He didn't say anything. Thomas Edmonds walked the cut rows with a measuring chain. The stubble left by the reaper was uneven. Some stalks were cut at 4 inches, some at 6. The cradlers left stubble at a uniform 3 inches, but the reaper's cut was clean. No shattered stalks, no grain knocked loose. McEdmonds checked the corners where the reaper had turned. The blade had missed about 9 inches at each turn. Across a full acre that added up to about 30 square feet of uncut wheat. Not enough to matter. The machine worked. Manning was watching his wager disappear. At noon, the cradlers stopped. They'd cut 2¼ acres combined. Hewitt had cut slightly more than half an acre himself. Koger had managed just under half. Bracken and Ewing were close behind. All 4 men were exhausted, their hands were blistered, their backs were cramping. They drank water from a bucket and ate cold cornbread and ham. They had 6 more hours of work ahead. McCormick's reaper had cut 3½ acres. It had not stopped except to turn at the end of each row. It had not slowed. The horse was tired but not spent. Cyrus McCormick ate his meal standing next to the machine, checking the blade for damage. There was none. The afternoon cutting resumed at 12:40 p.m. The temperature was 89 degrees. The cradlers were moving slower. Hewitt's pace had dropped to about 9 minutes per pass instead of 11. He was cutting less distance per swing. His form was still good, but his endurance was failing. Bracken stopped twice in the first hour to rest his back. Ewing's hands were bleeding through the cloth wraps he used to protect them. They kept cutting. They had no choice. A contract was a contract. They'd agreed to work the full day. Manning watched them and said nothing. The reaper cut its 5th acre at 2:18 p.m., its 6th at 3:52. The blade had dulled slightly, but not enough to jam. Cyrus McCormick stopped once to adjust the reel height. The adjustment took 4 minutes. Then the machine resumed cutting. By 4 in the afternoon, 21 of the 23 farmers who'd come to watch Manning's crew win were standing near the reaper, watching it work. They weren't mocking anymore, they were counting the passes. They were timing the blade. They were asking McCormick how much it cost to build. He told them he didn't know yet. He hadn't built one for sale. This was the only one that existed. At sundown, 7:34 p.m., the cutting stopped. Thomas Edmonds measured both sections. The hand crew had cut 3¼ acres total. Hewitt had managed just over an acre himself. The other 3 had split the remainder. The reaper had cut 6 acres and 47 square feet. McCormick had won. William Manning paid the $60. And then he asked McCormick how much it would cost to build him a reaper for next season. McCormick said he didn't know. He hadn't worked out production costs. Manning said he'd pay whatever it took. He couldn't afford to hire a crew again. Not if a machine could do the same work for the cost of a horse and 1 operator. Cyrus McCormick went home that night and wrote in his journal. The entry was short. Reaper worked, Manning paid, 6 acres cut. He didn't write about the farmers who'd watched. He didn't write about the orders he'd been offered. He wrote 6 words and went to bed. The next morning, he went back to the forge. He had orders to fill. He had no idea how to fill them. The problem wasn't whether the reaper worked. Manning's field had proved it worked. The problem was whether it could be built at a cost farmers could afford. McCormick's prototype had cost $87 in materials. The blade alone was $14 of forged iron. The main wheel was $9 in oak and iron fittings. The frame was $22 in cut lumber and bolts. Labor wasn't included in that figure. Cyrus and his father had built the prototype themselves over 4 months. If McCormick tried to sell reapers at cost plus labor, the price would be somewhere around $180 per machine. A farmer hiring a harvest crew paid between $40 and $90 for the season. A reaper at $180 would take 2 harvest seasons to pay for itself, maybe 3 if the crew cost was on the low end. That was too long. Farmers didn't have capital to invest in equipment that wouldn't return profit for 3 years. Most of them were already in debt. They needed machines that paid for themselves in 1 season, or they wouldn't buy. McCormick spent the winter of 1831 trying to reduce production costs. He simplified the reel design, cutting the number of wooden slats from 12 to 8. He shortened the blade from 7 feet to 6.5. He replaced oak components with cheaper pine where the load stress was lower. By March of 1832, he'd reduced material cost to $68 per machine. At a selling price of $130, a reaper would pay for itself in one season if it replaced a crew costing $90. That was barely viable. McCormick built two machines in the spring of 1832 and sold them both to farmers in Rockbridge County. One worked. The other jammed on the third day, and the buyer demanded his money back. McCormick refunded him and took the machine back to the forge. The blade mount had cracked. He'd used pine where he should have used oak. The weight saved wasn't worth the failure. He rebuilt the mount in oak and resold the machine. Between 1832 and 1840, Cyrus McCormick built and sold 29 reapers. Every one of them was built by hand in the McCormick forge. Everyone was slightly different because McCormick was still modifying the design. Blade angle, reel speed, wheel diameter. He was learning what worked by watching the machines fail. Farmers who bought early models were beta testers whether they knew it or not. Some of them were patient, others weren't. In 1835, a farmer named Jacob Hildebrand bought a reaper for $120. It worked for 11 days, and then the drive rod snapped. Hildebrand repaired it himself using a piece of scrap iron from his own forge, and the repair held for 2 days and then snapped again. Hildebrand wrote McCormick a letter demanding a refund. McCormick sent him a replacement drive rod made from higher carbon steel. Hildebrand installed it. The machine worked for the rest of the season. Hildebrand didn't write a thank you letter. He also didn't ask for his money back. By 1840, Cyrus McCormick had sold 29 reapers and had verbal commitments for 70 more. He couldn't build 70 reapers in his father's forge. He didn't have the space, he didn't have the labor, and he didn't have the capital to buy materials in bulk. He needed a factory. He needed investors. He needed to move somewhere with access to rail shipping and iron suppliers. In 1847, McCormick moved to Chicago. He built a factory on the north bank of the Chicago River. He hired 32 workers, and he installed steam-powered saws and drills. He contracted with an ironworks in Pittsburgh for pre-forged blades. By the end of 1848, the factory had produced 500 reapers. By 1850, it was producing 1,200 per year. The reapers coming out of Chicago weren't hand-built prototypes anymore. They were standardized machines built from interchangeable parts. The blade was always 6 feet 8 inches. The wheel was always 5 feet 2 inches. The frame was always white oak with iron brackets. The drive rod was always high carbon steel, half an inch in diameter. A farmer buying a McCormick reaper in 1850 knew exactly what he was getting. If a part broke, he could order a replacement and install it himself. McCormick published a repair manual in 1849. It listed every part by name and number. It included diagrams. It explained how to disassemble and reassemble the blade mechanism, the drive system, the reel mount. It was the first repair manual ever published for a farm machine. Farmers kept the manuals in their barns and referenced them when something broke. Most of the time, they could fix it themselves. When they couldn't, McCormick had begun training authorized repair agents in major towns. The reaper was becoming a system, not just a machine. The system only worked if farmers believed in it. And in 1851, most farmers still didn't. McCormick had sold 3,200 reapers by that year. That sounds like success. But there were more than 400,000 grain farms in the United States in 1850. McCormick had captured less than 1% of the market. The other 99% were still hiring hand crews, still cutting with cradle scythes, still losing money to labor costs that ate up half their profit. Why? Because they didn't believe a machine could replace men. They'd heard about reapers. They'd heard they worked in some conditions. But they'd also heard they jammed, they broke. They required constant repair, and they didn't work on slopes or in damp wheat or when the field had rocks. Most of that was true in 1840. By 1851, most of it was false. But the reputation hadn't caught up. Cyrus McCormick decided to force the issue. In 1851, the Great Exhibition opened in London. It was the first World's Fair. 13,000 exhibits from 25 countries. McCormick shipped a reaper to London and entered it in the agricultural equipment competition. British manufacturers mocked it. The Times of London called it a cross between a flying machine, a wheelbarrow, and an Astley chariot. The judges were skeptical. They agreed to a field test. July 24, 1851, a wheat field in Gloucestershire. McCormick's reaper against 3 British reaping machines and a crew of hand cradlers. The test was scheduled for 2 hours. The reaper cut 5 acres. The British machines cut a combined 2.5. The hand crew cut 1.25. The judges awarded McCormick the gold medal. The Times published a retraction. Orders from British farms started arriving in Chicago by September. The London trial changed how American farmers saw the reaper. If British judges and British farmers accepted it, it had to be legitimate. Orders in the United States doubled in 1852, doubled again in 1853. By 1855, McCormick's factory was producing 4,200 reapers per year and still couldn't keep up with demand, and other manufacturers entered the market. Obed Hussey had been building reapers since 1833. His design was different from McCormick's, but equally functional. By 1855, Hussey had sold 2,800 machines. Other companies followed. Manny, Atkins, Palmer, and Allen all had reaper models on the market by 1856. Competition drove prices down. A reaper that cost $130 in 1840 sold for $115 in 1856. Quality went up. Manufacturers started offering warranties. McCormick offered a money-back guarantee if the reaper didn't cut at least 1.5 acres per hour. Hussey offered free replacement parts for the first season. Farmers started buying. The Civil War accelerated adoption. In 1861, hundreds of thousands of men left farms to enlist. The men who stayed couldn't harvest the acreage by hand. They bought reapers or lost the crop. McCormick sold 8,000 machines in 1861. He sold 12,000 in 1862. Hussey sold 6,000. Smaller manufacturers sold thousands more. By the end of the war in 1865, there were an estimated 90,000 mechanical reapers in operation in the United States. The majority of them were in the Midwest: Illinois, Iowa, Indiana, Ohio. Wheat production in those states increased by 30% between 1860 and 1865, even though farm labor had decreased by 20%. The reaper was doing what McCormick had promised in 1831. It was replacing men, and it was doing it fast enough to keep the Union Army fed. After the war, reaper adoption continued. By 1870, there were 150,000 reapers in use. By 1880, more than 250,000. The hand cradle crews that William Manning had hired in 1831 were gone. A farmer with 80 acres of wheat could harvest it himself with a reaper and 1 hired man to rake and bind. Total labor cost, $12 for the season. In 1831, the same farm would have cost $60 in crew wages. The reaper had cut labor costs by 80%. It had also cut harvest time from 2 weeks to 4 days. That meant wheat could be cut at peak ripeness instead of being rushed or delayed based on crew availability. Grain quality went up. Prices stabilized. Farmers who'd been losing money on wheat started breaking even. Farmers who'd been breaking even started making profit. But the reaper didn't just change economics, it changed what farming looked like. Before 1831, grain harvest was a communal event. Crews of 20 or 30 men moved from farm to farm. They ate together. They slept in barns. Now they sang work songs to keep rhythm. Harvest was social. After the reaper, it was mechanical. 1 man on a machine, 1 man raking. Silence except for the chatter of the blade. The work got done faster, but the culture disappeared. Older farmers noticed. Younger ones didn't care. They'd never known the old way. To them, the reaper was just how wheat got cut. Cyrus McCormick kept refining the design until he died. In 1858, he added an automatic rake that eliminated the need for a second man. In 1864, he introduced a self-binding attachment that tied the cut stalks into bundles. By 1870, a single operator could cut, rake, and bind wheat without dismounting. The machine did everything except shock the bundles for drying. McCormick called it the self-rake reaper. Farmers called it the harvester. By 1880, most new machines sold were harvesters, not reapers. The reaper was already obsolete. It had lasted 49 years. Cyrus McCormick died on May 13, 1884 in Chicago. He was 75 years old. His company had sold more than 400,000 machines. His patents had earned him over $2 million. He'd won 23 medals at international exhibitions. He'd been sued 17 times by competitors claiming patent infringement. He'd won 14 of those cases. He was buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. The funeral was attended by more than 1,200 people. Farmers came from Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. Some of them had bought machines in the 1840s and were still using them. They came to say thank you. McCormick's widow, Mary, didn't speak at the service. Neither did his children. The only eulogy was read by a minister who hadn't known him. It was short, and it focused on McCormick's faith and his charity work. It didn't mention the reaper. The farmers noticed. The reaper that Cyrus McCormick demonstrated in William Manning's field in 1831 no longer exists. The prototype was dismantled for parts in 1834, but a reproduction built from McCormick's original drawings is on display at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. It sits in a glass case on the second floor. The blade is dull, the paint is new. The frame is oak, but it's never touched soil. Visitors walk past it on their way to see the cotton gin and the steel plow. Most of them don't stop. The placard next to the case says the reaper revolutionized American agriculture. It doesn't mention William Manning. It doesn't mention the $60 wager. It doesn't mention the 4 cradlers who cut 3¼ acres while a machine cut 6. Those details aren't in the museum. They're in county records in Rockbridge, Virginia. In letters McCormick wrote to his brother. In journal entries he made the night of the trial. The details exist. You just have to look. If you've ever operated a reaper, if your family has stories about the first machine that showed up in your county, if you know what it felt like to watch men get replaced by iron and oak, leave a comment. Tell me where you're farming. Tell me what your grandfather told you. These stories matter. They disappear if we don't write them down. And if this is the kind of history you want to see more of, hit subscribe. There are 100 more machines like this, 100 more trials, 100 more farmers who were right and farmers who were wrong. Let's find them.